Okay, we're in more than the home stretch. Like this is almost it. We've got this chapter and next. So why don't I pray and we'll jump right in. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you have brought us so close to the end of this book. We thank you for what we've learned, what we've shared, the blessings of Dr. Brand's wisdom and his manner of life that has touched so many, which now include us. So help us, Lord, to finish this chapter and this study faithfully and well. Open us up to what you would have us know so that we might portray your likeness in our lives and to others. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay.
Amen.
So as we start off, Sharon and I kind of chatted about this a little while ago before class started. This to me felt like wrapping up. This felt the least like all the other chapters in the sense of there was almost no medical slant to it. And some chapters have been very highly medical with lots of interesting, insider information. Some have less, and there's a little more devotional quality to it. This one, I'm not sure there was anything that seemed particularly medical, except maybe his student, the surgical student who was in a terrible car accident. But even that, it wasn't really into the medical side of things. It was more, sharing a personal story. So this does go back to the habit of starting off with something a little more of a personal anecdote, although it doesn't seem really medical at all. It is personal, but again, that kind of started off the chapter in a way that I thought the chapter continued, where it felt more like tying things together and preparing to wrap them up. It was very referential, I think, to things we've already talked about, already learned. And even if he didn't name stuff out loud, I was kind of finding myself thinking about earlier chapters, thinking about points that he had made, and now seeing them, if not come full circle, seeing ways in which they were applied through the lives of these people that he's talking about. Anyone have a different sense about the chapter?
Well, I sort of felt like I was reading a different book.
Yeah, it kind of felt that way, didn't it? So Philip Yancey is doing the actual writing. I assume that some of it's written, that Dr. Brand writes some of it himself, but a lot of it just might be through interviews or they sat down and they worked it out together. This one, to be perfectly honest, felt a lot more like one of the Philip Yancey books we've read in the past. It just had that kind of quality to the way it was written and some of the stories and some of the emphases. And it was a very good chapter, but it felt very different. So let's just, jump into this first little section. This first little section starts off with a personal anecdote and then kind of it shifts into a personal reflection. So who can kind of remind us how we start off? Anybody?
He's talking about the Sistine Chapel.
Talk about Sistine Chapel.
And graven image.
Okay.
That's forbidden. But modern art portrays Jesus in different ways than, well, as a fine figure, quite the opposite of what Isaiah talks about. And no beauty or majesty to attract us to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he shifts into that with that second section. This first one,
It's talking about Michelangelo.
Yeah, you know,
Mhm.
he's seen the Sistine Chapel up apparently.
Yeah.
And he kind of talks about maybe even be able to witness tourist watch, and then he gets to go in later for some reason. Like, that's nice. Anyone been to the Vatican?
I have,
All right, we got a bunch of people online. All of our online people have been to the Vatican. None of us in person have. World travelers, what did you think?
I was very disappointed in the Sistine Chapel only because I couldn't really look at it. As he described, you're let in with hundreds of people, and you're told to follow this pathway, and so you're looking so you don't bump into people, and you don't look at the ceiling. You don't get to. It's, that was very frustrating to me. But yes, what I did get to glimpse was just phenomenal. But it was a frustrating experience. After
It was
waiting
many,
in line
many
for hours.
years. Sorry, Mary. It was many, many years ago when I went. My grandson's 34 and he was 10 at the time. And there weren't big crowds there when I went. And it was a phenomenal experience. You could almost rise up into the heavens with it.
Mm.
And even as you went into the other memorabilia of the Italian Museum, it's one of the very few things that I have experienced that has left an absolute impression on my brain, in that I can many times just sit relaxed and I'm there.
Wow.
It's wonderful.
Sam?
Yeah, there was a lot to look at. I've been fortunate enough to go twice, and the first time was like Aunt Mary said, we're packed in like sardines, and you don't really get a chance to experience it. But they started doing smaller group tours after hours, and so the tour group that I was with, I was one of maybe a dozen people in the entire chapel by myself. With these other dozen people looking, and I could focus a little bit more and walk around a little bit more, and I really was able to appreciate the fact that there were so many different scenes all going on in one painting, that it's kind of hard to follow. It's so many things going on and so many stories interwoven into that.
I always marvel at that accomplishment, painting that. The artist is lying on his back,
Yeah.
painting, in essence, a tree in a whole forest.
Yeah. And for years, I can't imagine the scope of a project that lasts that long. So we actually have a framed, I'm looking at it right now. It's right there on the wall. The creation of Adam, and it's just a detail, but you can see exactly what he's talking about, where Adam is kind of reclined, and there's the hand, and then God surrounded by angels and reaches out the other hand, the fingers nearly touch, and one of the most surprisingly significant places that my mom and I experienced in the Holy Land was the excavations in Magda, where Mary Magdalene was from, and they unearthed, basically right after the time of Jesus, it was covered in sand and lost until the 90s. And one of their excavations, and you actually get to see the synagogue that in Magdala, where Jesus and the disciples would have gone on the Sabbath. And and it's preserved amazingly. You know, a lot of the stuff was made of stone, but you can even see some of the paint that was still there. And they found this kind of really exciting development. They found this carved stone that they believe represented the temple in Jerusalem. So Magdala is like, you know, I don't know, 20 miles, if that, from Jerusalem. It's not far, but it's far enough that it's its own place. And it's certainly, if you're just walking there, it's not next door. But this stone had been carved with symbols of the temple and was pointed in a particular direction as though it were pointing to the temple. So when you went to synagogue on Sabbath, you would hear the readings and whatever, but you would have this very physical reminder pointing to the temple, which wasn't all that far away. And those sort of representations are extremely rare. And they were kind of deciphering, like, this represents it was like an almond flower, or something like that. These were representations of the temple and pointing in the particular direction for the temple, but you almost never saw anything like this, or they were never preserved, because the Mosaic prohibition against graven images. And it wasn't just making an idol of a golden calf. It was, they basically said, well, so as to not get too close to screwing up, we're gonna go nowhere near that. We're not gonna make graven images of almost anything. And so that's why, there certainly is Jewish art, but there are extremely few representations of people, and obviously none of God. That was, strictly prohibited. And I think Dr. Brand kind of circle back around with that of why. So, what do you think? What's the summary reason of why there should be no graven images of God?
Because we're inclined to worship them.
Okay, sure. I mean,
Plus-
that's why,
plus God is-
over the course of church history, you have had iconoclasts who destroy crosses, crucifixes, icons, all that kind of stuff, or have just said, you shouldn't have Catholic churches shouldn't have statues of saints, maybe. Because there is a obvious natural inclination. If you see a thing, even if that thing is supposed to represent something else, you can kind of get fixated on the thing. So what else?
You can't represent God.
You can't. Sure. How do you pare down infinitude into a two-dimensional or even three-dimensional representation? And any way of doing that obviously is an enormously limiting thing. Now, without trying to get too philosophical, can you represent anyone comprehensively in a portrait, picture, or image? The near infinite complexity of a particular person, any random person,
Right.
their thoughts, hopes, feelings, dreams, every little nuance of their memories and relationships and histories, every square inch of their body, the way that they carry themselves. I mean, is there any way to fully or completely or even fairly represent another human being? I would say no. And yet, I think that there are images that I've seen of other people or even of myself, and there's something precious about it that it captures something real.
Mhm.
So a couple of Sundays ago, where it was the second Sunday of Easter, and it's always the Thomas story, and I always use in the bulletin cover the Caravaggio of Doubting Thomas, and you see the resurrected Christ, and he actually has his finger like in the hole, and it's this amazingly physical, beautiful, profound, like just the raw physicality of that image, and it's always struck me. And in one sense, you could say, well, it's blasphemous to even try to narrow down the scope of Christ in a single portrait, and did he really look like that, and what about his skin tone, and all this kind of stuff. But in the other thing is like, there was something so profoundly, almost miraculously devotional about that image. Or others, some sort of, can you think of a picture or a portrait, I mean, not obviously a photograph, but some sort of representation of Christ that just really struck you? Like it wasn't that was Jesus, but there was some kind of element about it that you were so grateful that it was represented in a way that allowed you to connect for a moment.
I don't know, but I've always wondered about the pictures of Jesus. I mean, they're all done by different artists,
Mhm.
done differently, and yet it's, it's him.
Yeah, isn't that something?
And how did, I mean, who painted the exact image of him? Is that really what he looked like? How do we know that's what he looked like?
Yeah, and we don't, obviously,
know.
but isn't that something that after all the centuries and all the artistic representations, we can almost always pick it out to say, well, yeah, that's Jesus. There's just something about that in and of itself, to me, is kind of remarkable.
In that sentence where it says that the authentic image of God is like found in the person of Jesus.
That's right. That's right. Isn't it, that's what Jesus tells his disciples himself, show us the Father, they asked him. And he said, have you been with me all this time and you still don't get it? I and the Father are one. If you want to see the image of the Father, it is within Christ. Now, we can say theologically, and in essence, philosophically, that God has a human body now for the resurrected Christ, who is resurrected body and soul. 2 Sundays ago, it was there's holes in his hands and from his side from the crucifixion. This past Sunday, after the road to Emmaus, and he meets his disciples and he eats fish. So there's a body. He says, I am no ghost. So there's a body. There's some sort of material human form, which has now ascended within the concept of the Godhead and the Holy Trinity. And if God is one and God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that shape now means something in an eternal sense. That form, that matter, that physicality, in ways that we can't really pin down in our heads. And what does the body mean, and the glorified body, and what about the atoms and all that kind of stuff that Tom's probably already thinking about. But still, there is some element of our real humanity that is now in the very essence of God. So shifting from that Michelangelo introduction, and he kind of offers another personal reflection where, as a guy who lived and worked in India for decades, couldn't go anywhere without seeing representations of gods all over the place. And that kind of personal take on, well, this is why, if you reduce God to the little statue or the depiction or whatever, it's everywhere. And does it trivialize things? And probably, but it just, where is the wonder? Where's the transcendence? All right. So as he shifts and he talks about, he makes, I think, a lot of hay from a couple of verses in Isaiah. So Isaiah 53:2-3, he had no beauty or majesty to attract to him, nothing in his appearance we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Right? And how is he applying those verses to how Jesus must have looked?
Not particularly attractive,
Okay.
possibly even deformed.
All right.
We picture him very Anglo-Saxon, and he was probably very swarthy.
Mhm.
Uh,
I don't know. I think we probably picture him pretty Italian. I think the Italians had kind of cornered the
Well,
market
yeah,
of
maybe
images
more
before
Italian.
the English ever did.
You're right.
Okay.
Can't help but thinking when he's describing some of his appearance when he was on the cross. How
Yeah.
It must have been just
Right.
horrible.
So here's my pushback, and I think whether this is Dr. Brand or Philip Yancey, my gentle, respectful pushback to this is, this is a part of the Song of the Suffering Servant, which goes hand in hand. Like there's only verses later where it talks
I know how
about.
to cut that out. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
That phone call, I don't know how to cut it out of my iPad, so
Oh,
I.
I'm sorry. So this is the same, that he was chastised for our transgressions, by his wounds we are healed. This is, I think, not exactly and only the crucifixion, but it's clearly like this, that's what it's pointing to. And I would push back with, I mean, I'm not going to get real upset like his Aunt Eunice, who's heard the thing about the hunchback and said utter blasphemy. I would just say that seems extremely unlikely to me. Physical deformity falls under categories within the Mosaic law, and some of them would have precluded him from being a rabbi. And I just think he's taking his point, which is a fair, fine point. Well, we've got an image in our head of Jesus, and he's either, a gloriously slender and tall European, or he's, super muscular and handsome with the long hair flowing in the wind, or whatever. I would tend to say, even reading these verses about, there's nothing to attract the eye, perhaps it's just a normalcy. Like in his averageness, he was nothing that anyone would ever look at physically and think twice about.
That makes sense.
I can't picture him other than just an average person.
Yeah. And if anything, the incarnation kind of lends itself, I think, to that. The averageness of, I identify with you so fully and completely. And the more, the more remarkable of a physical specimen he is, the less that kind of covers the broad stroke of humanity, maybe. I don't know. These are not real well-baked thoughts, but I think the whole, like, he was a beat up, ugly hunchback with only 6 fingers, I think is very unlikely in the sense of the gospel accounts would have mentioned that. Now, the problem with quoting from Josephus to say, well, we've got this, well, Josephus was not a Christian. Josephus was a little bit of an outsider all the way around, writing these histories. And he is, in some instances, relating what's being said, like what's the word on the street. And in the same way that the word on the street was in trying to discredit Jesus, lots of people said lots of things, such as he was the product of Mary and a Roman soldier, such as the disciples stole the body and paid off the soldiers who were supposed to be guarding it on the third day, such as, I mean, all these sort of things that were, ways to dismiss him or dismiss the account of the apostles or whatever. So I would just kind of put that in a, it wouldn't upset me, but I just think, in trying to make a point, which I think is a fair one and a good one, something to ponder, it can get a little carried away. I don't think that Jesus needs to be physically deformed in order to have any or all of us identify with him and he with us. But in knowing, whether it's on the cross or all the time, that he understood suffering and disfigurement, scorn and rejection from others, we all can maybe take something in that we would identify, whether we identify that as just sort of an emotional feeling at some point in our lives, or, like his leprosy patients, it feels like our fundamental being is one who has been rejected by society. It's one of the reasons why I think the incarnation represents each and all of us sufficiently in and of itself without getting too narrow. And I don't blink at a blonde Jesus and I don't blink at a black Jesus. And people who want to, like I said, well, he has to look like me or else, then I think you've got it backwards.
Yeah.
We need to look like him
Yeah.
or else.
Yeah.
And I'm a little more personally comfortable with a Middle Eastern depiction because to me that's most sensible. But either way, if the image is helpful in a kind of a devotional or a spiritual sense, I'm kind of okay with that. And then if it's not, move on. Move on. I've seen all sorts of cultural depictions where, whatever society, whatever culture, whatever, place in the world, nationality or race, I've seen native depictions, Inuit depictions, Japanese depictions, and whenever it's done, Christ starts to bear some reflections of that particular society. Okay. In the sense that he bears the ineffable image of God and yet also a comprehensive and universal image of each of us. And how that happens exactly and specifically, we can't know. How a Middle Eastern Jewish male 2,000 years ago somehow, but somehow I think that works out just fine. Just fine. It's not for nothing though. I remember our Holy Land guide once kind of getting into, it's easy to see Israel or Jerusalem as like historically sort of a podunk little place. Like even everything we're so familiar with in the Gospels, Israel was a small conquered province of very little importance to a much larger empire. And so it's kind of, you can sort of just like, well, what a rinky-dink little place. And it sort of was. And maybe we can take like, oh, well, God uses the rinky-dink to change the world. But he also said, if you look at a globe and if you ponder world history and you start drawing lines about where people are, where things have happened, strategic importance, military importance, everything else. It's like the world starts to center and it starts to kind of converge around there. You ever seen one of those maps where like, what's the dead center of the United States? And it's like some nowhere place in maybe Kansas or something. But if you could like average out all of the distances of the continental US and what would be like the center point. And it's almost like looking at the way the continents are structured, where do they come together? If not in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, Europe, and it all, if they were trying to center it down, where would that be? If not roughly in the Middle East. And world history, geography, it's lending itself, I think, to that in some level. And maybe it all does work for God's reasons. All right. The same mindset. Oh, no, yeah, we're good. I didn't want to skip the student part, but he's still kind of chewing on this, shocking thought that the physical body of Jesus was something that society would have rejected, kind of like his leprosy patients. And he has he quotes the Philippians 2:5, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, which we certainly ought to have. Can anyone think of how that verse continues? Okay, so what is in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. So this is the same passage about how he's in the form of a servant and did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. That's right. So that is the mindset. And I add that just to kind of clarify or amplify this mindset that his identity, his unity with God the Father was not something to be clung to and demanded and pushed on every interaction, but instead, if there's a fundamental way that we see him in relation to us and God the Father, it's as a humble servant. So if that's the mindset, like I could have everything and anything, I choose to serve and love. How can we show a mindset that doesn't insist on all that we could, but chooses what we should?
And that part of it is so much more important than appearance.
I think so. And that's not to say that appearance isn't a part of that equation. Whether you are physically beautiful or you are someone that people don't want to look at, or you have an appearance outside of the majority of your culture, and so you are always sort of feel like you're on the outs, that it basically says no matter what, whether you feel like you're in a position of making demands of other people, or you feel like you're in a position of never being able to make a demand, what should your mindset be, and how could it reflect the loving and humble service of Christ? That's not bad. That's not bad at all. And he's got this nice story about, he's been in a lot of big fancy churches and heard a lot of eloquent speakers, but his favorite was the fisherman, covered in fish. Anyone have someone in their life, a saintly person who from the outside, you would never assume anyone would ever pay attention to them, or this would be an important person. But there was just something about him. They've made a big difference to you, maybe, or
Yeah, he goes to church here.
A friend that I knew when I lived here 40 years ago, who just, to me, she seemed to be the typical servant.
yeah,
She was always doing something for someone else.
right.
Can you repeat that, please?
Someone that she knew when she lived here 40 years ago, who just looked like a typical servant, who was always doing something for someone else. There are, a few people that I can think of, and there's kind of assumption the world wouldn't look twice at them, yet they were profoundly faithful, powerful, influential people. The sort of people who make enormous differences, even though there was nothing that our society would look at and value. My mind goes very quickly to my friend the Archbishop, who was I just thought of a holy man, a saintly man. You could feel holiness radiate off of him if you were around him. But from the outside looking in, he was just this little shriveled gremlin of a guy who had kind of a raspy, somewhat obnoxious voice, New England accent, and just looked like somebody that you wouldn't look at twice. And yet his manner of life and how he chose to live and what he did, you could just being, like if you just sit around him for a few minutes, you could just kind of feel holiness come off him like warmth. And there are folks that I just think there's a preciousness about them that if you were only looking on the outside, or if you're only judging on a criteria of success, you never think about again. And yet, maybe more valuable than all of them put together. Part of my antipathy towards celebrities is this sense that there's something more valuable about an image than a person that you know. Whether it's a celebrity movie star or even a celebrity preacher, you don't actually know any of these people, or it's very unlikely that you know them. Versus the person who is maybe right up the street from you, who actually has the qualities that we admire in someone else from afar, and they have tons of it. But because they're right here, or because they seem like no one special, it's easy to not notice. All right, so who can remind us about Mary, his promising surgical student?
This was the one who lost the use of her legs.
Mm-hmm. Terrible car accident, lost use of her legs. So what did she do initially?
What was it?
She what?
I think she was a physician.
She was going to be. Yeah, she was still a student at the time.
And she believed that God would restore her legs.
Yeah, so what did she, she was convinced God was going to restore her legs. So what did she do?
She won't accept physical.
No physical therapy for a long time. Just, God's going to heal me.
She finally gave up the idea and went to medical school, which just, wow.
So
That is pretty ironic. A medical student who believes in medicine and treatment, refusing the treatment.
Yeah, right.
And, for instance, and I forget her name, but the girl that was in the Boston bombing. And,
Okay.
and lost her leg. And she was in the news a lot about her recovery. And now she's been able to recover like almost completely with the prosthetics
Mhm.
that have come so far. And she can wear a high heel and she can do all kinds of things. And so she's taken it upon herself. She feels like that's her mission in life now, is to be able to help provide those kind of prosthetics.
Yeah.
Other
So other
amputees.
people, yes, right.
Okay.
So here's a woman who looks like she's lost so much. Her ability to walk. She had, very significant facial scarring that they could never really correct. She perseveres not just through her studies and, becomes a doctor, but she in particular, the difference that she makes for those leprosy patients.
Mhm.
Says all they have to do is hear the squeak of her wheelchair coming, and they all get excited.
It's like Johnny Erickson Carter.
Okay, yes, yeah, Johnny Erickson, Tata, if anyone know her stuff.
Yeah, she had an accident when she was 17 and now she's 6 something.
Yeah,
She has done a lot with wheels.
that's right. It is, only understandable for people to feel bitter or lost or, cheated or angry or just wanting to quit when things in life take very significant or tragic turns. But to see someone who had something identifiably similar, who can show firsthand, it's not just a platitude from somebody who wishes well, but has no idea what you're going through. But someone who has been in a position very close to yours, sometimes a position you would think is worse, but they handle it differently and they show you a different way. And there just seems to be a little more credibility maybe. And whether or not she's more credible for these leprosy patients, they definitely seem to gravitate towards her.
And the Granny Brand story.
Yeah, boy, Granny, but she was a tough little nut, wasn't she?
Okay.
We're sure.
I'm gonna, show my poor character by saying, I wonder if she was all that pleasant to be around. Like, she just seemed to be such a hard case.
Mhm.
I would get exhausted, that there obviously this beautiful life of amazing self-sacrifice that probably touched countless lives, but even if regardless of the numbers, probably touched each of those lives in innumerable ways. And there's no way to quantify that or the value on it. But at some point, I kind of wanted her to ease up a little. Like, let the poor people build you a coffin, lady. They want to.
Carrying her around at 93.
Yeah, right. Yeah, like we're all going to carry her from this 93-year-old woman from village to village so she can keep going. Wow. But, these were lives changed because of her devotion and sacrifice. And a steadfast commitment that if God has called me to do this, why would I stop now? Of course I have reasons. Everybody has a reason not to do this. But she just never quit. I'm super impressed by that. I'm also extremely intimidated. And, just like, gosh, lady, take a break. You know, I'm tired just reading.
Yes. Makes me embarrassed to be so lazy in my retirement.
Yeah, for sure. There is something that is certainly inspirational, but also, you know, kind of, you know, almost otherworldly about people who have done such heroic sacrifices. I think of a story with someone talking to Mother Teresa after they had seen the work of the Sisters of the Poor and say something along the lines of, well, I could never do what you do. And she was basically saying, well, that's okay. I couldn't do what you do. And there was both an affirmation that God calls us to different things, but also a kind of an encouragement that whatever it is the Lord has called you to do, do that. Do that. And not everybody can be Mother Teresa. Not everybody should be Mother Teresa. But if we are called to serve even in a heroic fashion, or a fashion that is not the heroism we would choose. We had vestry last night, and we were talking about some of these ongoing things, and there were a couple of folks who have been doing so much that I had to keep saying it, you know, thanking them and letting people know, because a lot of the stuff they were doing on an ongoing basis were the sort of things that don't get attention because they're not interesting, they're not, you know, visually appealing, they're not, I don't know, they're not the sort of things that you look, oh, I'm so glad you did this thing. It's all the background stuff. It's all of the behind the scenes stuff. It's all of the foundational things that you don't notice and you don't really care about until it doesn't work. So, you know, people don't necessarily walk into a room and say, oh, air conditioning, I love air conditioning. You just sort of walk into a room and it is what it is. But if it's not working, like, oh, what's wrong? Well, someone has to make sure these things happen, right? Oh my gosh, you turn on the air conditioning. Thank you so much. But there are folks who, you know, you might say it's yeoman's work or whatever, but they, the service, the sacrifice, the care of all the little things, and especially stuff that we count on, but don't think about twice. We don't even notice that somebody has to do it. It just so happens that there's no one who exemplifies that better that I can think of than Sharon, who does that sort of thing on a daily basis. Yeah, we would be so up a creek on a Sunday morning without Sharon. You guys have zero idea how much she does. None. I barely have an idea of how much she does just to have stuff already set. So when I arrive 3 hours before everybody else, half the stuff is already finished. So sometimes you don't have to go looking around for granny brands. Sometimes heroic service is right in front of you, if you'll notice.
That's exactly right.
All right, so what else? How do we finish up?
The last part, as we allow the mindset of Christ to guide us. That last part.
We too become more accurate bearers of his image.
Yes.
Yes. And we all, with unveiled faces, contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So that section from 2 Corinthians. Unveiled faces contemplating the Lord's glory. You know what that's a reference to?
Transfiguration?
Sort of, yeah. But even that's a reference to something else. Unveiled faces.
When Moses went up in the mountain to see God and he had to veil his face because he was
Every time, and this would happen on multiple occasions, Moses would commune with God on top of the mountain, and he would come down and he would glow or shine or something to the point where it's freaking people out. They're like, Moses, you got to cover that thing up. We are going to lose our minds. And so he began to need to veil his face. The unveiled face, contemplating the glory of God, is connected to multiple things in Scripture. But I would see, like, you know, with no barriers in the way, to be in the glorious presence of God. Not just, you know, Moses covering himself, whatever it is we could be covering ourselves with, anything that any front that we put up, any mask that we wear, any persona that might get in the way between our truest, most authentic self and being in the very presence of God, when that's all stripped away, and it's just us, raw us, in the very glorious presence of God. And that would be something that would just transform us. I would say this is really a vision of this is a beatific vision. As we die and are awoken by the Lord, being in that presence like a fire that consumes all of the dross, leaving only the gold left, like burns away all the nonsense of life, all the stuff that we've put on or carried or been given to us, and to be transformed into his image. Shine. There's a good transfiguration. What else? All right, well, I guess we are now one chapter away. We are one chapter away. It's always been my assumption we would take a couple of weeks off, partly for whatever new book to arrive, for whatever schedules that need to be hammered out. So as far as I see, we're going to hit next Wednesday, close off next Wednesday. We'll take a week or two off, and then we will restart a new book, which we have still never decided upon. So
I wondered if you had any in mind.
I mean, we've talked very vaguely and broadly about a couple of options. No one has, you know, made such a compelling case we can think of no other. Are we still in that same position of kind of like, I don't know?
I don't know, but I'd like it to be one that's easy to read and as interesting as this one.
Mhm.
You know,
Hard act to follow.
I don't know how to follow this book. You know, it's been I had never seen this book before. Apparently, a lot of people have read it over the years in different versions, but I never even heard of it until, you know, a year and a half ago when I kind of stumbled across it, and I just thought it was fantastic. So I offer no promises because I don't know. This one was a home run in my mind.
Yeah.
A home run.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So tough act to follow.
Well, I have a question for Sam and I, the outsiders. How will we know when and what book? And
Well, I would say we will talk about it. We can make a decision, and then we can either communicate with each other by next class or via email to say this is what, this is when, and have any ordering instructions where you could get a book if you don't have one already.
okay,
Okay, I'm gonna just go. So I mentioned this a month ago, that it had been in my head that at some point I would like to take a crack at Out of the Silent Planet. And since we are still up in the air without knowing which direction to go, I'm gonna say, let's try that. So that is the first book of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. It's a more adult novel rather than the Narnia books for kids. But, you know, he and his friend J.R. Tolkien kind of had a wager to step outside of their normal comfort and genres and to write something completely unexpected. And Lewis was supposed to write science fiction, and Tolkien was supposed to write time travel. And C.S. Lewis wound up writing his books, and Tolkien never finished his before he died. But it's going to be very different than this. It's more of a novel. It's a story. But I always found it truly fascinating.
What is the name of it?
Out of the Silent Planet. And it basically tells the story of a man who was kidnapped and against his will, sent off on a rocket to Mars with the hopes and plans that Mars can be colonized for use. When he gets there to discover that what we have termed space, which seems vast and empty and sterile, is in reality closer to the medieval concept of the heavens. The entire universe echoes the voice of God. What might it look like to see a planet and its inhabitants who never fell from grace? Earth is the silent planet. For in our fall, we've tried to separate ourselves from a presence of God that should be all pervasive. But that's what he finds on Mars.
I'm game.
Are we all right to try?
Sure.
Okay.
Especially since.
Is anyone going to throw a shoe at me or something if we do this?
Interesting.
It's gonna be hard from our end.
A digital shoe.
Finding a cool water there, so there could have been.
You'd have to have a strong arm, Sam.
All right. So I've checked in the past, and you can get a pretty nice new copy from Amazon for about $12. We can order them in the office if you would like, or you can, directly get it to yourself. But I would say we wouldn't do anything for a few weeks.
Okay.
But it is Out of the Silent Planet, C.S. Lewis, and we'll look to that as our next book and see how it goes.
Okie dokie.
Wednesday at 12, Wednesdays at 12, or?
Yeah, we'll stay with our same time. We'll stay with our same time. Okay, we good? All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Here.
Bye, everybody. Have a
Bye,
good-
everybody.